Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Business of Bioenergy, a podcast about building, scaling, and running bioenergy companies around the world. I'm your host, Jackie McAllen.
And I'm your co-host, Corey Woolard.
Welcome to our first episode. Before we dive in, allow me to set the stage and introduce myself. I am a science communications expert with nearly 20 years of experience supporting innovative companies, industrial companies. I help them influence, inspire, and increase their impact.
Hey everyone, I'm Corey. I have 25 years of diverse manufacturing experience ranging from chemicals to bioenergy.
Today's episode is about the policy landscape that is shaping the future of the bioenergy industry. From the regulatory tailwinds that are accelerating adoption to the headwinds that are creating friction for producers, investors, and end users, we ask the question, what does it take to stay compliant, competitive, and credible in today's shifting environment? Whether you're scaling bioenergy technology, funding the transition, or managing a facility that's considering biomass, this conversation will help you anticipate what's next and what really matters. I'm delighted to introduce our guest, Thomas Meth. Thomas, would you mind giving our audience a brief introduction?
Jackie, thanks for having me. Corey, nice to see you. I'm Thomas Meth. I've been in the bioenergy space for 25 years. I was one of the co-founders of Enviva, the largest wood pellet manufacturer in the world. I also served as the chairman of the U.S. Industrial Pellet Association for 8 years. I've been at the forefront of the development of bioenergy from a regional, small-scale solution to a global, large-scale decarbonization and defossilization opportunity and industry. I'm very happy to be here, and hopefully we can have a very interesting conversation.
Thomas, good to see you again, old friend. As you just alluded to, you've been a staple in the bioenergy space for quite some time. Throughout your career in bioenergy, you've had to navigate some pretty complex and shifting policies. I think you bring some very real-world perspective on how governments shape the bioenergy space. Let's talk about that at a macro level. Can you describe what you see as the major policy tailwinds in our industry, and then also talk a little bit about the headwinds that we're experiencing in today's markets?
Corey, in order to talk about the tailwinds, I'll look a little bit at the history. RED I was the first catalyst for this industry. The Renewable Energy Directive in 2009 set the stage for utilities in Europe to convert coal plants to biomass power plants. That required multi-million tons of biomass. Where some of these coal plants existed, biomass was not available at that scale. They had to look across the globe to see where large-scale, rateable, reliable biomass could be sourced from. It had to be sustainable and meet some of the regulations. That allowed for large-scale, significant infrastructure investments into supply chain. That meant building wood pellet plants. That meant building port infrastructure on both ends to allow for that trade. Now you have 25 million tons of wood pellets go from A to B to actually replace coal. So in a very short period of time, it's been a significant growth for the industry. We can look back and say we've accomplished a lot to go from zero to where we are today. You asked about tailwinds. In a world where intermittency dominates the energy grid, when you have a decarbonized and converted power plant to biomass, it's very hard to imagine that biomass plant is not a core part of the grid in certain jurisdictions, whether it's the UK, the Netherlands, or Denmark. But tailwind certainly is once you have converted the power plant, it is in all likelihood going to continue to run. Even with some policy changes in the United Kingdom, you will still see major power plants like Lynmouth Power and Drax continue to run on biomass. Without that, the grid is at risk of not having enough electricity. Other tailwinds are certainly technology advancements that we've seen in the industry. Technology advancements come in the form of usage of biomass in alternative applications than just power. We talk a lot about the sustainable aviation fuel space. We talk a lot about hard-to-abate industries looking for a renewable carbon alternative to switch from fossils. And that's a big tailwind for the industry. Think about a steel mill or a ferroalloy plant in Europe. Until very recently, they did not have to pay for carbon emissions. Only now that those industries have to pay for carbon, but it's still at 20% or 30% of the actual carbons that they emit. But by 2035, all of these industries will have to pay for 100% of their carbon emissions. And that allows for biomass to provide alternatives that are cost competitive. Because when you don't just compete with coal, but you compete with coal and carbon, many of the biomass solutions that the industry offers are actually competitive with the fossil-based case.
Very interesting.
You talked about, or you asked a question around headwinds. Well, we have to acknowledge that biomass is complicated and not without its controversies. Touching trees is very sensitive, and it's important that the industry continues to explain its sustainability practices, but also create the necessary transparency that people are comfortable and confident that bioenergy actually creates more trees and not leads to negative outcomes. I think as an industry, we have not done a good enough job to really explain that so far, and that has created some headwinds. Biomass is still, when sustainably done, one of the most cost-effective alternatives to fossil fuels, and in particular, as we have increased intermittency when the wind does not blow and the sun does not shine, generating power, heat, or use biomass as a reductant are alternatives that are cost competitive. Biomass is hard to beat as one of the solutions to create more sustainable outcomes in the energy world.
Thomas, before we move on, I really want to touch on something that you said regarding the narrative around touching trees, as you put it.
Yep.
Can you give our listeners a sense of what you mean there? Maybe there's an example you can think of which stakeholders are influencing whom around that narrative. How does that actually play out?
Let's start with the kind of wood that the bioenergy industry uses, should use, and has used, and as a complement to the timber industry. What do I mean by that? Landowners do not grow trees for bioenergy usage. They grow trees for sawmills to turn trees into timber, and we build houses with them. We use them as building materials and many, many other usage of that wood. And when you think about a tree, 50% of that tree you can mill in a sawmill and turn into timber products. The other 50% has typically gone to the paper industry. And the paper industry is really dramatically declining, or has been declining for 25 years. Every couple of months, you see some very big announcements about another mill closure. Just very recently, I think just last week, we heard about mill closures in Georgia and South Carolina. It's devastating for the landowners to lose a portion of their revenue stream because the pulp and paper mills are not there anymore. It's problematic for sawmills to actually not be able to sell those sawmilling chips and sawdust to the paper industry because the paper mills have shut down. The bioenergy industry is vital to keep the equilibrium of maximizing yield and revenues for the players in the forest industry. You have to understand that in order to get comfortable with the sustainability of bioenergy. As long as we keep that equilibrium intact, bioenergy is certainly a sustainable alternative. It can be scaled up. But Jackie, you asked, what are some of the issues? When you don't scale bioenergy, it's always a rounding error and really doesn't make a difference, right? When you scale bioenergy, it's scary because it's, large. That's why transparency and communications are so vital, that we bring folks along. We're not as close to this industry as, Corey and I have been for 25 years, and increase the comfort of all of our stakeholders.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that includes the policymakers who are making decisions about the industry, who certainly are not experts like yourself or like Corey.
So you've spent a lot of time and energy in Asia Pacific. Let's transition to that geography. Let's talk about what you've seen happening relative to Asia Pacific.
When you talk about Asia Pacific, you talk about really predominantly Japan, to some degree South Korea, a little bit about Taiwan, but that hasn't quite materialized as I think many participants that had hoped. The biggest market for bioenergy is Japan. There are two sources of bioenergy: fuel for the Japanese market palm kernel shells out of Southeast Asia, and wood pellets from North America and Southeast Asia. North America could come from the US as well as British Columbia. The impetus for some of those long-term agreements was a little bit different than in Europe. It wasn't dominated by conversion of coal plants. After Fukushima, Japan was short electricity generation, and Japan built a significant number of new power plants to reduce carbon emissions compared to nuclear generation. The Japanese government created a policy to encourage the use of biomass as 100% fuel for some of these new power plants. That journey in Japan started a few years after Fukushima, and now a lot of these power plants are up and running or about to start operations. They had a feed-in tariff, most of them at 24 yen per kilowatt hour, and that has led to significant investments both in North America and in Southeast Asia to supply those power plants with biomass fuel.
So would you say that the energy transition in Japan from the government and subsidizing the power generation market, or is there another reason?
Well, at the time, it was certainly a subsidy. When you think about in today's environment, 24 yen per kilowatt hour, with some of the realities that have impacted electricity costs, 24 yen per kilowatt hour is not expensive electricity anymore in Japan. It's quite cost competitive. I don't think the journey to use biomass is completed. Japan has certain efficiency goals for coal plants that go into effect in 2030. And one of the most cost-effective alternatives to reach those goals is to coal-fire with biomass. I expect quite a bit of development there. One of the learnings in Japan, and that's different than in Europe, is that port infrastructure is really hard to come by. That means storage of white wood pellets has been extremely expensive and difficult. So a lot of those users or potential future users of biomass are looking for a black pellet. Obviously, very early stage technology-wise or from an infrastructure scale-up perspective. In Japan, that's the one market where the Japanese will, in all likelihood, opt for a higher fuel cost to avoid investments in port infrastructure because it's so expensive and difficult to do. Some of the thermal applications in the steel industry already receive some incremental subsidies for that. So there's certainly momentum in Japan to increase biomass usage. I'm quite bullish about that market and its development.
I'm curious, Thomas, so you said it's the one market that might be willing to pay more and really invest in or switch over to black pellets. Do you mean that globally, or you mean of the markets in Asia?
I do mean that globally, actually. One of the things that have changed, and maybe it brings me back to the headwind conversations, is Europe has been struggling for years now. Austerity measures are quite pronounced. And I don't see a future in Europe with massive subsidies as a support scheme. I believe that biomass in Europe has to be competitive with a fossil alternative plus carbon pricing. And that's really hard to do with a black pellet. For that, you need some policy mechanism or a very substantial capacity payment for a peaking plant. We have to figure out how biomass competes with fossil fuels and carbon to fit into the narrative of austerity and the reduction in electricity bills in Europe.
Thomas, a lot of attention around sustainability, right? You've got private sector certifications like the Sustainable Biomass Program. You've got regulatory things going on like RED 1, RED 2, and RED 3. So kind of explain to our audience that evolution over time and what specifically are they looking at from a sustainability standpoint?
What most folks who haven't been around as long as you and I, Corey, don't know is RED 1 actually didn't come with mandatory sustainability criteria. Only the RED 2, the Renewable Energy Directive 2, came with sustainability criteria. And that was, I think, not only overdue, but also very important for integrity. It didn't change the fundamentals of what was sustainable and what was not, because individual countries, but also users of biomass, established criteria instead of governments. And governments then implemented them as mandatory as we went through the journey here. The biggest change for RED 3 is that power is no longer subsidizable. If you feed in tariff for power-only applications for biomass, you cannot get that subsidy as part of RED 3. RED 3 has narrowed somewhat the sustainability criteria, but the industry, by and large, and I would say 95%, has preemptively always met those criteria anyway. So I don't see any supply changes in any material form, which is consistent with what the industry has done. The industry was at the table to have those discussions. There was a lot of education necessary. Jackie, you alluded to this earlier, right? Not every regulator or politician is an expert in something important in the energy system, but still a bit of a niche in some areas. We did a lot of education to make sure people understood as an industry. From a supply perspective, RED 3 does not really limit what can be used. There are some greenhouse gas emissions restrictions now that are tighter than they had been in the past. So that means you have to use biomass for your dryer. You can't use fossil fuels for your dryer and your pellet plant. Long distance shipping from places like Vietnam to Europe could be difficult to meet those criteria under RED 3. A very consequential regulation that will come into effect January 1st of 2026 is EUDR, the deforestation regulation that requires incremental sustainability assurances from suppliers. But I don't see any issues in North America or Europe to comply with EUDR. I do see some issues for certain elements of the supply chain coming from Asia, particularly in the woody space, into the EU. The UK is a more forgiving on that front because they have not included forest products and forestry as part of their deforestation regulation. The EU did include that.
Interesting.
Thomas, let's head over to the US now, since we spent some time talking about Europe, talking about Asia. In the US, of course, the administration and Congress recently passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. How does that affect bioenergy, both in the US and globally? What are you seeing there?
The Trump administration has issued multiple executive orders encouraging the use of bioenergy, timber, and any forest product. It's very market oriented. And the premise is, if you have revenue from your forests, you're much more likely to plant new forests to manage them more efficiently. And been true in the United States for the last 100 years, and is particularly true now. The biggest concern that the administration has are the wildfires in the West. The wildfires are not caused by the lack of forest management. They're exacerbated by the lack of forest management. The West is very dry. Dry periods are the west of the United States has always been prone to wildfires. But because on federal and state land, forest management was frowned upon over the last 30 years, there's a lot of underbrush and understory in the woods, which dramatically exacerbate wildfires once they happen. What the administration wants to encourage is industries to come in, help manage those forests, take out that underbrush, use it for bioenergy, and make the forests a little more resilient against wildfires. The administration is very positive and pro-bioenergy from a source perspective. So they encourage exports to other countries, right? The narrative around trade deficits clearly fits into that story. Really important, great tailwinds there from their perspective. The paper mills are shutting down, so that really pronounces the need for other outlets and other markets. From a usage perspective, I see a much more limited set of applications. The Inflation Reduction Act provided tax credits for potential growth applications for bioenergy, and I think at best they're uncertain at the moment, as opposed to Europe and Asia, where local natural gas resources are rare, and particularly in Europe now with Russian gas staying out, dependent on LNG, which is higher in costs. Bioenergy and biomass can be much more competitive, particularly when you have a carbon credit. In the US with natural gas at the cost levels that it is and no carbon price, it's very hard to envisage that biomass can actually be competitive.
That's a good segue into Thomas generation 2 of pellets. And you've kind of hinted to this in the discussion around Japan and lack of port size, supply chain management and things like that. Can you give our audience some insight on what the next 5 to 10 years look like from an R&D perspective on biochar, black pellets, which has a lot of different definitions, and bring our audience up to speed on your perspective in regards to that.
Joined Javelin a year ago, one of the largest bulk commodity traders in the world. One of the big areas of expertise the firm brings is that it's also one of the largest suppliers of metallurgical coal to places like Europe to deliver different forms of specialized coal to the steel industry, to the alloys, ferromanganese industry, and so on and so forth. The specific need there is a renewable bio-based carbon alternative with a certain level of fixed carbon. Some want 80, 85%. Many others will be satisfied with 60% fixed carbon. That is a big growth area for this industry as a whole, because if you can deliver that at the price of coal plus carbon, for every ton of coal, these industries have to buy 3 tons of carbon. So that gives you a sense as to what the revenue opportunity for biomass is in that space. White wood pellet has a fixed carbon content of around 20%. So that won't work. Right. And if you allow me, let's go take one step back as to how did the industry actually end up in a white wood pellet. And a white wood pellet has the advantage that it is homogeneous. So all the particles inside a white wood pellet basically identical, or for the most part, both from a moisture perspective, from a chemical composition perspective, from a size perspective. And then it has enough lignin in it that you can actually run it through a press and keep it together and transport it across the world for very, very reasonable, I would almost say, in large skips, very low cost. So it makes it transportable on a cost-effective basis, but also on a safe basis, because wood dust is very explosive. A wood pellet, try to take a wood pellet, take a match, try to light it on fire. It doesn't work. You may get a smolder, right? So that's how we got to a white wood pellet: safety and cost. You have to go through another carbonization or roasting process to get to a higher fixed carbon level. So you need similar infrastructure than a white wood pellet plant, one incremental step, and then it's very hard. The lignins are gone, so you have to go through an extra binding process. So you need a binder to keep the now biocarbon particles together to make it transportable. But I think the industry has come a really long way. Some of the companies that have made huge investments over the last 2 years, I'm very impressed with how much progress they have made. So we're getting to a spot now where the technologies are getting to a point where you can convince yourself that technologies are ready for significant infrastructure investments. I would also say that on the torrefied side of things, from a nomenclature perspective, it's important. When we talk about biocarbon, I mean high fixed carbon product. When we talk about biochar, we mean charring biomass and then use it as an agricultural product, basically, and you bury it into the ground to keep the carbon locked up. When we talk about thermal black pellets, we mean either torrefied pellets or steam exploded pellets. They still have a low fixed carbon content, a little higher calorific value than a white wood pellet. But the theory of the case is that torrefied pellets as well as steam exploded pellets are hydrophobic, which means you can store them outside. So you don't need the investment in storage. That means your conversion costs from a coal plant to a torrefied or steam exploded pellets are much lower, if not negligible, right? But the fuel costs are higher because you add another step to the factor white wood pellet. But also there, lots of development. The market for that is Japan. I see very limited markets for the thermal side in power plants in Europe. That is certainly something that I see much more in Asia.
And Thomas, how about the rest of the world? So we've talked now about Asia, Europe, North America quite a bit. Do you want to share some perspective on what you see in South America or Africa?
I think there are 2 questions in your question, Jackie. One is the supply and one is the usage. Maybe I'll just take supply first. One of the things that I've spent a lot of time on over the last year since I've been with Javelin is to expand from just manufacturing and selling white wood pellets to what we've just talked about, torrefied, steam exploded biocarbon, but also to the agricultural biomass side. Palm kernel shells, acai, nut shells. And when you talk about the countries you just mentioned, South America, acai, 96% of all acai superfruit is grown in Brazil. A lot of the nut shells come from West Africa, for example, right? Javelin's expertise, they're very comfortable sourcing from there because a lot of the fossil products come from difficult countries. In the biomass space, to comply with EUDR and deforestation regulations and legality, It's always been much more difficult to go into more adventurous locations, call it. Agricultural biomass, if done right, could certainly play a role and is very cost competitive compared to fossil alternatives plus carbon. A lot of these countries could play a role, whether that's Indonesia, Malaysia, West Africa. Woody biomass is more complicated in those regions because of UDR regulations, which just put assurance requirements on the supply chain that I don't think are easy to meet. You have a lot of momentum in places like Indonesia. You have a lot of momentum for biomass usage in India. I don't think that's going to mean any tailwinds from the global commodity perspective. A lot of that biomass is going to be local. China, for example, is a very closed market. There is a lot of biomass being used, but it's from within China. It does not participate in the global market at all.
So what is driving the adoption of biomass usage in some of the Southeast Asian countries you mentioned? Let's leave China aside. Is it policy related?
Yeah, it is policy related. It's pressure to reduce fossil carbon, particularly coal. That hasn't gone away. Many of those countries have requirements to establish a reduction in coal usage. Local biomass in India can be very cost competitive to that. It's a question around building supply chains inside. I'm no expert in India, but it's certainly not an easy feat. People work on it, and it certainly has a lot of momentum.
Thomas, this has been a great overview and an excellent discussion. Could you share any last thoughts from a stakeholder or an investor who might be wanting to get into the bioenergy space, whether they're supplying, whether they're building a new asset or something of that nature? Do you have any words of wisdom for our audience of those potential stakeholders?
I think, Corey, when you have been in the biomass space, as long as you and I have, you have some scars, and with scars comes some wisdom.
That's right.
I would say a few things. I think one element where I learned a lot, some of it the hard way, is that when you build a new biomass plant, a lot of people come with business plans to me, and that is dependent on project finance. I'm typically skeptical of financing structures for large infrastructure projects in biomass, particularly when you have some of the new technologies involved that we're talking about. Because I think a lot of them will work, but it may not be a straight line. And that means to have a strong equity partner that if there is a timing delay or if there's a cost overrun, who as long as the fundamentals are still intact, will be comfortable to finish the project, dramatically de-risks the development and the execution of such a project, which in turn makes it much more likely that a customer is actually going to sign up for a contract. And once you are operational and cash flowing, you can refinance your balance sheet. You can put some debt on it, supported by the cash flows that you generate. But don't start there. I think that's one word of wisdom, particularly in the biocarbon space. You got to start with the wood even more so than with any other biomass because you use so much of it. When you think about a white wood pellet to go to the same tonnage of a biocarbon, you need 3 times more wood. Right. And so that may require different thinking in terms of where to go and how to scale up that industry. Sustainability is only going to get more complicated, so nobody can take a shortcut there. I mean, that's maybe an obvious statement, but you can't take a shortcut there. And then the last thing I will say, which is actually something I should have said first, we have to start with safety. We still have way too many safety incidents in this industry. You can't underestimate that.
Thomas, back to your other points around sustainability, I think that is very sound advice because it's only going to get more stringent. Companies are going to have to be willing to not only advocate, but spend additional funding around, sustainability programs, be more proactive in their approach, perhaps, in some of the sustainability fronts as well.
That's right.
Thomas, I think we could talk to you all day. I really lost track of time. This was an excellent conversation. Thanks. It's been a pleasure having you.
Absolutely, Jackie. It was great to be on your show. Good luck with all your series and podcasts, and I can't wait to hear all the other speakers